Mac lay in the vast, echoing silence of his bedroom. The room was so large that even the smallest sound seemed to bounce from wall to wall, amplifying the emptiness that surrounded him. The bed, though grand and imposing, felt almost comically small in the center of the cavernous space, as if he were a child lost in a world built for giants. Every night the silence pressed in on him, thick and heavy, making it hard to breathe. Moonlight painted the high, ornate ceiling in shades of silver and ash. The intricate plasterwork, once the pride of some long-gone craftsman, now seemed to shift and shimmer in the pale light, casting strange, twisting shadows that danced across the walls. The patterns overhead were beautiful, but tonight they felt almost alive, like a silent audience watching from above, waiting for something to happen. The mansion was a relic, inherited from a distant relative he barely remembered. Its halls were lined with portraits of stern-faced ancestors, their eyes following him wherever he went. The stillness of the place often pressed down on him, a constant reminder of the generations who had lived and died within these walls. Tonight, though, the silence was different, charged, expectant, as if the house itself was holding its breath. He couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every creak of the floorboards, every sigh of the wind outside seemed to carry a hidden meaning. He shifted in the antique four-poster bed, its dark wood cold against his skin, the carved posts rising like sentinels at each corner. The sheets felt heavy, almost suffocating, as if they were trying to pin him in place. His gaze drifted upwards, drawn to a shadow near the edge of the moonlight. It was a subtle shift, a flicker in his peripheral vision, so faint he almost convinced himself he'd imagined it. But the longer he stared, the more certain he became that something had moved up there, just out of sight. The ornate ceiling, with its swirling patterns and deep recesses, suddenly seemed full of hiding places, like an eye, slowly closing. For a heartbeat, he was sure he saw the suggestion of an eyelid, a wrinkle in the plaster that hadn't been there before. Mac blinked, his heart hammering in his chest. When he looked again, it was gone, just the familiar ceiling, silent and unmoving. He let out a shaky breath, trying to convince himself it was just a trick of the light. He stared at the spot, heart thudding against his ribs. Just an old house settling, he told himself. The rational part of his mind tried to take over, listing all the logical explanations, shifting shadows, tired eyes, the mind's tendency to find patterns where none existed. But the fear was real, a cold knot in his stomach that refused to loosen, shadows playing tricks in the darkness. He'd always prided himself on being practical, unshaken by ghost stories or tales of haunted houses. But tonight, the mansion felt different, less like a home, more like a living thing, watching and waiting. A prickle of unease lingered, settling deep in his gut, making it impossible to relax. He rolled over, pulling the heavy duvet tight around his shoulders. The fabric was thick and comforting, a small barrier against the vastness of the room. He wouldn't give in to childish fears, he told himself, not in his own home. He squeezed his eyes shut, willing himself to ignore the strange sensations crawling up his spine. The house creaked and groaned as the night deepened, each sound magnified by the emptiness. Somewhere in the distance, a clock chimed, its echo lingering long after the last note faded. Mac tried to focus on his breathing, counting each inhale and exhale, searching for comfort in the rhythm. But his mind kept drifting back to the ceiling, to the shadow that had seemed to move, to the feeling of being watched. But as sleep finally claimed him, a fleeting image lingered behind his eyelids, a single black eye staring down from the ceiling. It hovered in the darkness of his dreams, unblinking and silent, watching him with an ancient patience. Even in sleep, Mac could feel its gaze, cold and unwavering, as if the house itself had finally decided to reveal one of its secrets. And somewhere, deep inside, he knew that this was only the beginning. Days slipped by, each one blurring into the next, and the image of the blinking ceiling light began to fade into the recesses of Mac's mind. He tried to focus on other things, mundane tasks, the ticking of the old clock, the distant hum of traffic outside, but the memory lingered, like a shadow at the edge of his vision. Even as he went about his daily routine, he found himself glancing upward, half expecting to see that strange flicker again. The house, with its thick walls and heavy silence, seemed to press in around him, amplifying every stray thought and half-remembered image. He tried to convince himself it was nothing, a trick of the light, a fleeting illusion brought on by fatigue or imagination. But the house had a way of whispering its secrets, subtle and persistent. At night, when the wind rattled the windows and the shadows stretched long across the floor, Mac felt the weight of the mansion's history pressing down on him. The air seemed charged with something unseen, a presence that lingered just out of sight, just out of reach. He found himself drawn to the ceiling more and more, his eyes tracing the intricate patterns of the molding that wound their way across the plaster. The wood, once familiar and comforting, now seemed different somehow. The grain was tighter, the lines more pronounced, as if the very texture of the house was shifting beneath his gaze. Sometimes in the half-light of dusk, he thought he saw the patterns move, twisting and writhing like living things. He would reach up, fingertips brushing the surface, searching for some explanation, some flaw or imperfection that might account for the change. It was like looking at skin stretched taut over bone, the faintest hint of veins pulsing beneath the surface. He ran his hand along the rough plaster of the wall, feeling for dampness, for cracks, for any sign that the house was decaying from within. The texture was uneven, the surface cool and unyielding beneath his palm. Sometimes he imagined he could feel a faint vibration, as if something deep within the walls was stirring, restless, and alive. At night, when sleep eluded him, Mac would wander the halls with a flashlight, illuminating corners and crevices, searching for the source of his unease. The beam would catch on motes of dust, swirling in the heavy air, and for a moment he would imagine he saw movement, something shifting just beyond the reach of the light. He would pause, heart pounding, listening to the silence, waiting for the house to reveal its secrets. But there was nothing, just the cold, unyielding surface of the walls and ceiling as solid and impenetrable as ever. No cracks, no dampness, no sign of the life he imagined pulsing beneath. Yet the feeling persisted, growing stronger with each passing day, a sense that the house was watching him, waiting for something. And yet, whenever he looked away, he could have sworn he saw it. A ripple, a twitch, a subtle undulation in the plaster, as if the ceiling itself were breathing. The shadows seemed to shift and dance, forming patterns that vanished the moment he tried to focus on them. It was as if the house was alive, its heartbeat echoing in the silence, its breath stirring the dust in the air. Mac tried to rationalize it. The house was old, he told himself, settling into its foundations, creaking and groaning as the seasons changed. He had read about such things, how old buildings could play tricks on the mind, how the brain could invent patterns where none existed. But the explanations felt hollow, unconvincing, as if he were trying to talk himself out of a nightmare that refused to end. The air was different here, thick and heavy with the weight of ages past. Every breath felt laden with dust and memory, as if the house itself was exhaling the secrets of those who had lived and died within its walls. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the occasional creak or sigh of settling wood. But beneath it all, a seed of doubt had been planted in Mac's mind, and it was beginning to grow, twisting its roots deep into his sanity. Each day, the line between reality and imagination blurred a little more, and Mac wondered how long he could hold on before the house claimed him too. Sleep became a fragile thing. Every creak of the old house, every sigh of the wind against the window panes, sounded like a whisper from above. His dreams were haunted by the feeling of being watched, a presence looming just out of sight. One night, he woke with a gasp, his skin clammy with cold sweat. A sound had pierced the darkness, a soft, wet sigh that seemed to come from directly above him. He lay there, paralyzed, listening for any repetition. The silence stretched, thick and heavy. He told himself it was nothing, just a nightmare bleeding into reality. But as he lay there, staring up at the ceiling, he swore he heard it again, a whisper, barely audible, forming words he couldn't quite make out. His name, perhaps? or something else, something darker, slithering from the shadows of his own subconscious. The line between reality and nightmare began to blur. He was losing his grip, and the ceiling watched, a silent, knowing observer to his descent. Max stopped lighting the fireplace in his bedroom. The room, once warmed by the gentle crackle of flames, now felt colder than ever. The absence of fire left the air heavy and still, as if the darkness itself had thickened, pressing in from every corner. Shadows clung to the ornate moldings and the faded wallpaper, making the space feel smaller, more suffocating. Each night the silence grew deeper, broken only by the occasional creak of the old house settling, or the distant howl of wind rattling the window panes. The flickering flames had once seemed comforting, but lately, they danced across the ceiling in ways that unsettled him. Grotesque shapes would form in the firelight, writhing and pulsing with a life of their own, twisting into monstrous figures that seemed to leer down at him. Sometimes he would catch glimpses of faces in the shadows, faces that didn't belong to anyone he knew, faces that seemed to watch him with hungry, unblinking eyes. The more he stared, the more the shadows seemed to move, as if they were aware of his gaze and eager to perform for him. Unable to bear the sight any longer, he took to sleeping on the chaise lounge in the far corner of the room, his back pressed tightly against the wall. It was a small comfort, a desperate attempt to put some distance between himself and the ceiling above. He would curl up, knees drawn to his chest, clutching a thin blanket as if it could shield him from whatever watched from above. Every night he arranged himself so he could see the whole room, as if vigilance alone could keep the terror at bay. But deep down, he knew it was futile. But it was no use. No matter how he positioned himself, no matter how tightly he wrapped the blanket around his shoulders, the feeling remained. It was as if the very walls of the mansion were closing in, suffocating him with their silent, watchful presence. He felt small and powerless, a trespasser in his own home, unable to escape the gaze that bore down on him night after night. The sensation of being watched never left him. It pressed on his chest like an invisible weight, making it hard to breathe, hard to think. Sometimes he would wake in the middle of the night, heart pounding, convinced that something was standing over him just out of sight. He would sit up, clutching his chest, straining to hear any sound that might betray the presence of another. But there was only silence, thick and oppressive, broken only by his own ragged breathing. He found himself staring at the ceiling for hours on end, unable to look away. The cracked plaster and faded paint seemed to shift and ripple in the dim light, forming patterns that hinted at something lurking just beneath the surface. He would search for any sign of movement, any hint of what was watching him. Sometimes he thought he saw it, a flicker of motion, a shadow that didn't belong. But when he blinked, it was gone, leaving him to wonder if his mind was playing tricks on him, or if something truly was there, waiting. Desperate for relief, he tried to leave the house, hoping that fresh air and sunlight would banish the oppressive atmosphere that had settled over him. He would stand in the open doorway, one foot on the threshold, heart pounding as he looked back into the shadowy halls. The world outside seemed brighter, safer, but he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched even there, that the mansion's gaze followed him wherever he went. But every time he stepped outside, a wave of dizziness would wash over him, making the world spin and blur. It was as if invisible hands were reaching out, pulling him back, refusing to let him go. He would stumble on the steps, clutching his head, disoriented and weak. The further he tried to get from the house, the stronger the pull became, until he had no choice but to turn back, drawn inexorably to the mansion and the entity that resided within its ancient walls. He was trapped, both by the house and by his own growing paranoia. The rooms felt smaller each day, the walls closing in, the air growing heavier. He would pace from room to room, unable to sit still, haunted by the feeling that he was never alone. Sometimes he would sit in the corner, arms wrapped around his knees, staring at nothing, listening for footsteps that never came. The silence was maddening, filled with the imagined whispers of things unseen. Sleep offered no escape. Even in the darkness, with his eyes squeezed shut, he could feel the ceiling's gaze upon him, cold, calculating, unblinking. It was like a predator, patient and relentless, sizing up its prey. Night after night he lay awake, paralyzed by fear, knowing that whatever watched him from above would never let him rest. The mansion had claimed him, body and soul, and there was no way out.